Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear us fine? Well, we're going to assume you all can hear us good. So, hello, I'm Jason Lewis. I'm the owner and publisher of the Los Angeles Standard newspaper. I'm here with Kamilah Moore, the chair of the California Reparations Committee, and we're here to talk about how hate has historically impacted Black communities. This discussion is in partnership with the California vs. Hate campaign and also with California Black Media. So we'll get started on it?
Sure, yes.
So in 2023, the California Hate Crime Report showed that over half of the racially motivated hate crimes, the victim of those crimes were Black people. Yes. Now, Latinos accounted for 19%, Asians 12%, white people only 5%. Did someone say something? No. So white people are only 5%. Now, hate against Black people didn't just start 5 years ago or 20 years ago. It's been a historic problem. That's why it's great to have you on, because the Reparations Taskforce did an extensive study on how oppression and hate impacted Black people. So when we think about hate crimes against Black people, the first thing we think about the violent crimes. So can you talk about how historically violence has impacted Black communities?
Oh yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jason, for having me, first and foremost. And yes, as you mentioned, the California Reparations Taskforce, we had whole hearings talking about hate crimes, right? How Black folks have been impacted by hate crimes in the state. But before that, we had a grounding conversation, grounding hearings on, to your point, the history of violence against Black folks, Black Americans in this country, which starts with slavery, right? Violence was institutionalized and sanctioned by all levels of government through slavery, right? Our enslaved ancestors were forced to work 18 to 24-hour days nearly, by threat of the gun, by threat of violence, right? If they tried to run away, they could be killed, right? And so when we talk about the violence against Black folks, we can have a modern conversation, but we have to root it in the history of slavery in this country. And even after slavery was abolished in this country, Black folks were still met with extreme forms of violence in this country through lynching, through other various, racial programs. And then to this day, hate crimes, where we learned through the California Reparations Taskforce, to your point, the data that despite popular belief, a lot of people don't seem to think this is true, but yes, Black Americans are the #1 victims of hate crimes in the city of Los Angeles by far, in the state of California by far, and of course in the nation. We have been the #1 victims of hate crimes in the United States since the nation's inception. Last point I'll say when we talk about California, when we talk about the history of violence and racial terror in this state in particular, and slavery, yes, California did have slavery in this state. We also had a fugitive slave law, which was very rare for free states at the time. So California was not a sanctuary state for runaway slaves, right? So if you so happen to run away to California from the South through this fugitive slave law, it essentially deputized ordinary white citizens to do a citizen's arrest, take you to the courts and the jails, and then you could be essentially deported back to the South to be re-enslaved, or in some instances actually enslaved on California soil, right? We had slaves that were slaving in the gold mines and all across this state, right? There were slave colonies in San Bernardino. So I just wanted to uplift again, the history of violence of Black people nationally, but also I know this is a California specific conversation. So also I want to weave in those points as well. The last point I'll say about California when we talk about the history of violence, a lot of people don't know, right? We had KKK members in this state in actual government and official positions, right? There were more KKK meetings held in California at a certain point of time, more than in some places in the South. So, just want to bring all that in the beginning of the discussion, and thank you for such a well-crafted question around the history of violence of Black folks. We have to connect the dots between the mass of percentages of the fact that we are victims of hate crimes in this state and in this country, tying it to our history of being victims of slavery, racial pogroms, mass lynching, all of that.
Because, so it's interesting because I think about my family, and I'm sure we all have family stories of where there was violence done to us. My great-grandfather ended up here in Los Angeles because he was from East Texas, and they tried to lynch him. He was a blacksmith, and he owned a car shop, and there wasn't that many cars, so he got all the business. So he did extremely well. So they tried to lynch him, and he ended up here in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And he was living here in Los Angeles off of Hooper in Slauson, and this is like in the 1920s, and he actually bought a house in a white neighborhood, and the sheriff showed up in a mob. They tried to push him out of there. So he got his gun and he threatened them, and they left him alone. So
wow.
That violence has continued. I'm sure everyone, if they look down their family history, and hopefully everyone's spoken to their grandparents or great-grandparents and got those stories, because even here in Los Angeles, we still dealt with violence, and even, well, I guess you could even say up to and recently, because we still deal with the police violence and stuff like that.
Yes,
and as we see from the hate crimes in Los Angeles, not just California, but in Los Angeles, we lead. We're most of the victims of the racially motivated hate crimes. To go to our next subject, to tell another quick short story. My grandmother, when she came here in 1924, she went to school here, and she didn't want to go back to Texas because the schools were because the education system was. She said that they were teaching her some stuff here, where in Texas that they were teaching her nothing. So I was doing a story on a local high school, predominantly Black high school, and I was speaking to one of the Black teachers, and she said that if you ever want to, if you want to control or sabotage a community or group of people, you suppress education. So can you speak about how historically education has been taken from us, or how it's been difficult for us to get the same quality education?
Yes, absolutely. And to your point, this is exactly what some of the findings that came out of the California Reparations Taskforce, 1,100-page final report that we released June of 2023. In that we found that, yes, the United States, falsely, the United States and particularly also slave owners, right, falsely believed that they had to deny their slaves education, to dominate and control them. And so when we're talking about, the suppression of education of Black folks, there's still obviously remnants of that today. But again, we have to tie it to history. We have to tie it to slavery, where, as I mentioned, right, enslavers would essentially, tell their, meet their enslaved folks with violence, right? If they, were found to have read or write. And then, even after, so that's to say, yes, we were completely denied the right to education during slavery. Even after slavery ended, we still were denied our full right to education. Obviously, during the Jim Crow era, we did not get the same, through segregated schooling, we did not get the same resources as white schools. But even as school segregation ended via ground versus board education, we started to see integration, quote unquote, we learned through our expert witnesses at the task force that, for instance, with integration, a lot of Black teachers, a lot of Black administrators, a lot of Black principals, they were all fired. Right? Because they weren't going to be hired to teach white students, right? And so a lot of, our brilliant, teachers, school administrators literally were excluded out of the school system once integration hit, right? And then on top of that, you had our Black students, trying to integrate into these schools that are being taught by white folks, and they were still met with violence. We talked about Ruby Bridges. We talked about the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas. In California, when we're having a California-specific conversation, there was still, barely any attempts to actually integrate public schools in California. And so schools in California, by and large, still to this day, are segregated, remain segregated. And one of the main data points from the task force is that California is the 6th most segregated schooling state, right? We're supposed to be this progressive state that has, the bastion of progressive values, but of all 50 states, our schools are the 6th most segregated, right? And also it's tied to the fact that, a lot of our education is tied to property taxes. So that means Black and Latino folks, Black folks in particular, right, relegated to communities where we were redlined, where we were denied home ownership opportunities by and large. So we are more likely to be renters than homeowners. That goes into the amount of money that can be used for property taxes for our schools. So it's all connected. And so, I'll just end by saying, yes, white supremacy has definitely negatively affected Black America's collective, ability to obtain education, starting with slavery, which they completely excluded us from being able to be educated, but then also systemically and institutionally after slavery as well.
All right, so now Malcolm X, he had a quote. I'm not saying this verbatim because I don't have it in front of me. So he said something to the effect of when you grow up in a poor neighborhood, you go to a poor school, you get a poor education, and you get a poor job. So it makes you think today we still hear stuff like the first Black this and the first Black that when it comes to employment and a Black person getting a certain type of promotion at certain companies or stuff like that. And that shows that historically Black people have been denied employment opportunities. So how have Black people been kept out of the workforce, and how has that impacted the plight of Black America?
Yes, so let's talk about California specifically. Again, pulling data and anecdotes from the California Reparations Taskforce report. We had a whole chapter on stolen labor and hindered opportunity, where we talked about Black labor essentially. And in California, for instance, we found that certain cities, major cities, did not hire Black folks in mass until after the 1950s, 1960s.
Excuse me?
Yes.
There's an echo.
Huh.
I'm having a hard time hearing.
Okay, maybe I can move the speaker a little closer. Just move everything a little closer. Is that better?
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me tilt this up. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, so as I was mentioning, several California cities did not hire Black workers until the 1940s, and certain cities not until 1970. So for instance, in San Francisco, the fire department, they had no Black firefighters in the San Francisco fire department before 1955. And by 1970, when Black residents made up 14% of San Francisco city's population, only 4 of the department's 1,800 firefighters were Black. And so again, that's just one excerpt from that chapter from the California Reparations Task Force. But yes, to your point, I love how you're framing these questions. We pride ourselves a lot saying, first Black this, first Black that, but that is indicative of exclusion, right? We should be on our 100th Black this. We should be on our 1,000th Black, a position. But, the fact that we still in 2024, are saying and having to claim this is our first Black person in this particular position of power and authority is case in point for why reparations is so sorely needed.
All right, so now with entrepreneurs, so today white-owned small businesses, well, I'll go back. All right, white people are about 67% of the population, I think, around there. But white-owned small businesses produce 87% of the revenue. Black people are about 14% of the population, but we only produced 1.1% of the revenue from our Black-owned small businesses. So how have political policies and hate crimes negatively impacted Black-owned businesses?
Yes, so the task force, we also talked about the devaluation of Black-owned businesses in the state of California. And actually, you know, as many people know, the task force, we recommended direct cash payments to descendants of slaves. But we actually recommended direct cash payments to address specifically, in part, the devaluation of Black businesses. We asked for we recommended direct cash payments for other forms of harm, state-sanctioned harm too, like mass incarceration and over-policing, housing segregation, unjust property takings, and health harms. But the fifth kind of state-sanctioned harm that the task force actually worked with economists to say, look, there needs to be direct cash payments to justify this particular harm. It was the devaluation of Black businesses. Because the economists that we worked with, they found some really striking data. They found that there actually should be 60,000 more Black businesses in the state of California than there currently is. And they noted that these missing Black businesses, they're missing due to the state's discrimination against Black folks who are trying to form businesses and against Black folks who are trying to maintain the businesses that they currently have or to scale them up, which, you know, is important when you just mentioned the data where white-owned businesses nationally produce almost 90% of all revenue, while Black-owned businesses produce about 1%. And so, yes, the devaluation of Black businesses is I think very important to address. And they were devalued again by the state's own actions and omissions through redlining, through loan discrimination, through various other different forms of discrimination. And so I'm hoping to see actually through, you know, future legislation, I want to see legislators really address this vacuum that we see, this dearth of Black businesses that we see. And I think that it needs to be addressed in the framing of, look, the reason why we don't have Black businesses is not because of any internal problems of Black people not being entrepreneurial enough or not hardworking enough. It's really an institutional problem that needs solving on an institutional level as well.
And so, a point you started to touch on the education question, I believe, was homeowners. More money from property taxes leads to better education. So with white American households, 72% of them of those households are homeowners, and only 28% are renters, while Black people, 44% of Black American households are homeowners and 56% are renters. Communities with large amount of homeowners receive more resources and more funds for education than communities of renters. So how have Black Americans historically been blocked from home ownership?
Right. So Black Americans have been historically blocked from home ownership in a variety of different ways that we uncovered in the task force through one, redlining, right? You know, governments working with banks to mark certain areas to be, you know, not, investable in a sense, like marking areas that were predominantly Black as areas that, you know, were again, not deemed, investable for various different instances. There was also racially restrictive covenants as well, where we talked about in the task force. We would think that racially restrictive covenants may have been relegated to the South or the East, but we had racially restrictive covenants in California, in Los Angeles, right? Essentially stating Black folks cannot live in these certain areas, like certain areas, with nice property, nice houses, relegating us, a lot of Black folks, to the projects, right? A lot of my family grew up in the projects. I didn't necessarily connect the dots around this until, I went to college, law school, got on this task force, really entrenched myself deeply in the studies. Why did my family grow up in the projects? Oh, because of redlining, because of racially restrictive covenants. They couldn't get a house on the west side because there was a covenant that said they couldn't live there. And then also, a lot of people don't know, even after California deemed redlining and racially restrictive covenants illegal, you still had Black folks being met with violence by white Californians who just could not take Black folks living in their neighborhoods. So in the California Reparations Taskforce report, we have actual pictures, right, of folks like Roger Duncan, and other Black male homeowners who lived in LA, who are looking at their homes wrecked by a firebomb, with a note left at their houses by white folks in the neighborhood saying, you need to leave, right? So there was actually an increase of violence against Black homeowners in the state of California after California deemed racially restrictive covenants and redlining illegal. But California still didn't, in terms of law enforcement, still didn't really protect these Black homeowners, even though, you know, these racially restrictive policies were deemed illegal. And so I just wanted to uplift that as well. And then I guess the last note I'll say on the housing piece as it connects to the education piece, again, having to connect the dots. A lot of people say, well, hey, you know, these schools, they're funded by property taxes. It is what it is. But you have to really look deep into it. How fair is the fact that these schools are funded by property taxes when we just talked about how, you know, we can't necessarily, contribute, Black communities can contribute in terms of property taxes when we've been relegated to be renters on an institutional level by racially restrictive covenants, by redlining, through all these other institutional avenues to which have really led us to the fact that 44% of Black Americans own homes compared to 72%. Again, just last point I'll say on this, I say this a lot in different conversations because I think it's important. I think Black folks, we've internalized a lot of the kind of deficiencies that we've been met with. We've internalized, okay, well, we're 44% of us are Black, are homeowners, most of us are renters. There's something that we're probably doing wrong ourselves. I feel like Black Americans, we kind of internalize that too much. And this is why I think the work of the task force was so important, because it gets us out of that self-defeating internalization and it gets us to externalize, like, no, this is not our problem, right? These issues were caused by governments on local, state, and the national level, and they need to rectify for it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now as we get to the 60s and the 70s and Black people finally have civil rights, we got hit with mass incarceration. So how has mass incarceration targeted Black Americans, and how has that impacted Black communities?
Yes. So again, bring this back to slavery. After slavery, that's what we saw the tenets of mass incarceration started to form when, you know, you had the advent of the Black codes, you had, you know, convict leasing, but in particular in the state of California, as I mentioned, we recommended direct cash payments. And we recommended direct cash payments for 5 state-sanctioned harms that I mentioned earlier, and one of them was mass incarceration and over-policing for a particular time period, as you mentioned, from 1971 to 2020. That's our economists kind of define that era of mass incarceration to kind of had started around 1970 and has continued on since. And then tied to that, you know, in California, like the rest of the country, you know, African Americans were more likely to be shot by the police, arrested, killed, imprisoned, more than the share of our population. And in fact, we're 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than any other group. And so, you know, mass incarceration has impacted particularly the Black family, right? Black men, but also it's really impacted the Black family. Because yes, while most Black men, in terms of who has been incarcerated in our community, it's been mostly Black men, and we need to center that. Families have also been impacted when their men are in prison, right? Just a specific example, that's income that's taken away, right, from the family. That's time and energy that's taken away from the family when they have to travel out of state or hundreds of miles to go visit their loved one, right? And so mass incarceration has had a devastating effect on Black Americans since 1970. And that's why we as a task force were very bold in recommending direct cash payments to rectify for California's role in perpetuating this system. So I also hope to see in the coming years, legislators in the state of California introducing direct cash payments reparations bills, but also nationally, I would love to see Congress doing that as well. I would love to see reparations policies that are directed towards, essentially rectifying for that system of mass incarceration.
All right, so now with all of the policies that we've spoken to that have been oppressive to Black people, has that directly led to the wealth gap and the plight of Black America? And should Black Americans receive reparations not only for slavery but the 100 years of segregation?
Yes, all of the policies we discussed and more, because we don't have the time to go over the 2 years of work of the California Reparations Taskforce. But the Reparations Taskforce, we actually identified 12 major areas of reasons why there should be reparations, what we called the 12 lingering badges and incidents of slavery that still persist in the society, 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that has its roots in slavery, but still persists today and negatively impact Black Americans, all of which we discussed earlier in this conversation, from housing, mass incarceration, Black businesses, but we talked about other things as well, like Black health. But let's talk directly about Black wealth, because that is the question that you asked. And one of the lingering badges and incidents of slavery we discussed at the task force is the wealth gap, right? Some of the data we found is that it would take over 228 years currently, without any government intervention, without AKA reparations, it would take 228 years to close the racial wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans. Like currently today, white households have 9 times, nearly 10 times more household wealth than Black Americans. In California in particular, in Los Angeles, I'll say, because California doesn't actually have a racial wealth gap study. Nationally, there's the racial wealth gap study. That's where that 228 year gap comes from. But that was actually one of the recommendations that came out of the California Reparations Taskforce, was for legislators or for some entity to actually take the time to do a wealth gap study to figure out what's the wealth gap, particularly between white Californians and Black Californians, because we have the data on the national side. Locally, in Los Angeles, we also have some specific data around the wealth gap. In Los Angeles, we found that Black Americans have, Black Los Angelinos, I should say, Black American Los Angelinos have about $200 worth in terms of liquid wealth, compared to over $110,000 for white Los Angelinos. And so there's a wealth gap that persists locally in this country. I mean, in this state, presumably in this state as well, but we don't have that specific data yet. And of course, nationally. I think the last thing I'll say, and particularly on the wealth gap, I want to uplift the words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., because he talked about the wealth gap before his assassination, right? When he said, words like, for instance, while the federal government was refusing to give the Negro any land, at the same time, the federal government was giving away millions and millions of acres of land to its newly arriving white peasant class coming from Europe, which Dr. King went on to say meant that the federal government was willing to give this newly arriving white peasant class an economic floor through the Homestead Act, through giving away those millions and millions of acres of land, while at the same time denying that same opportunity for Black Americans. Most Black Americans, we were excluded from these public policies that were aimed to build wealth, like the Homestead Act, like the GI Bill, like the various different policies in the New Deal, right? These are specific instances of public policy sanctioned by all levels of government that excluded, by and large, African Americans, which is why we're in the bucket that we're in today, which is why it's going to take 228 years to close that gap without significant intervention from the government.
Okay, so in my final question, how will an incoming Trump administration impact the reparations efforts here in California and nationwide?
You know, the jury is still out on that. I did an interview with The Guardian right before the election, and they asked me, what do you think a Kamala Harris presidency could look like for reparations, and what could a Trump presidency look like for reparations? And I'm gonna be frank. I said a Kamala Harris presidency, if they also have a blue House and a blue Senate, could have looked really good for reparations. Having, you know, a blue president, blue House, blue Senate, it would have given reparationists, I think, potentially the scenario to lobby people who claim they're like-minded, right? In the Democratic National Party's convention, in their policy platform, they actually endorse reparations. So the idea in terms of what I said to The Guardian was, look, if we have Kamala Harris as the president with the blue House and the blue Senate, that could potentially give us the recipe for us to hold, you know, Democrat legislators' feet to the fire in Congress, and then also with her to actually sign a reparations bill, because she mentioned how she wasn't particularly interested in signing a reparations bill via executive order, but if Congress had passed it and it got to her desk, she would have signed it. That's what she said, so I'm taking her word for it. So I said, you know, that would have been potentially good for us. However, that didn't happen. And I said in the article with the Trump presidency, I said, frankly, it may not look too good for us because, well, one, no journalist during the campaign trail actually asked Donald Trump, this particular campaign trail, his thoughts on reparations. I think a journalist asked him in the previous administration, and what he said was, I don't think it's likely. So obviously I take that as he doesn't support it. And then also during the campaign trail on his Twitter profile, one of his tweets, it was like, you know, a shot at Kamala Harris saying, these are all the policies that Kamala Harris would support if she were to win. And one of the bullet points was taxpayer-funded reparations. Again, it was from his Twitter page, so I'm assuming, look, you're against reparations. And so I just said that whole story to say, what could an incoming Trump administration, how will an incoming Trump administration impact the reparations efforts here in California and nationwide, based on his past history and statements on reparations? It doesn't seem like he supports it. So it seems like this 4 years is going to be a struggle, to put it mildly, for reparationists. But look, people didn't think slavery was going to end, right? People look at reparationists and think, what we're doing is pie in the sky anyway. So we're not going to be deterred by a Trump presidency. We're still going to, no matter who's in office, reparations has said this, we're going to continue to push the issue, because reparations is a sacred justice claim. It started with our enslaved ancestors, like Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson, because contrary to popular belief, yes, ex-slaves did fight for reparations, right? They were targeted by the federal government and all, and that's a conversation for another day. But conservatives always say, well, you guys were supposed to fight for reparations back then. Why now? Well, we've just been met with resistance. And so again, I'll just say reparations is a sacred justice claim. Current day descendants of slaves were standing in the shoes of our ancestors. So we're going to continue to fight for reparations here in this state and nationally, no matter who is president.
All right, cool. So those are all my questions. So if there's any questions from anyone who joined in the conversation, if you have any questions, please go ahead. Well, I guess there's no questions now.
Okay, great.
So I want to thank you all for coming and joining in. Was there a question?
Oh, will you do this again?
I will be doing this again, and I would love to interview you again and do it in front of a larger audience next time.
Yeah, sure.
So let's see. That's the question. Will you do this again? So yes. Now I would like to participate as much as possible in the reparations movement. So I mean, I'm just a writer on a newspaper, so I'm not an activist, but I feel that I can cover what you all do, and because I support the movement, that I'm trying to write some positive stuff on things you all do.
Yes.
So please let me know how I can assist story wise, and I'm in.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you all for showing up.
Thank you.